Hello and welcome to F1 with my uncle. I'm Matt and I'm joined by my uncle Dan, and today we are talking about sprint races. So, Dan, what are sprint races?
Hey, Matt. Yeah, this week we have our first sprint race, and we're talking about the sprint format, how these races differ from what we normally see on a weekend. So, what happens is there are two practice sessions and not three. The qualifying session that we're used to seeing on Saturday is now held on Friday, and it is the same Q1, Q2, Q3 format. However, the grid results that result from qualifying define the grid for the sprint race on Saturday as opposed to the main event on Sunday. And the results of the sprint race on Saturday determine the entire grid layout on Sunday. So it's quite a change, and it adds an additional race and removes a practice. And qualifying is for the sprint, not for the main event on Sunday. So in a nutshell, that's what a sprint race is and how it differs from a normal race weekend.
Yeah, so sprint races were originally introduced last year in 3 races, and there were initially going to be 6 races for this year because they were popular. However, that was changed to 3 races this year instead for various reasons.
Yeah, exactly. There were going to be 6, now there's 3. The official reason had something to do with, compensation. The FIA did allow a additional amount of money for sprint races to the $200 million cap that, the teams have now, and they had a structure that if a car was damaged, they got a certain amount of money, probably not enough to cover a serious damage on a car.
Yeah.
But the bottom line was expanding it, was something that they just couldn't agree on a compensation model for, so they decided to keep it at 3.
Yeah, essentially, there's a lot of added pressure this season with the regulations having such a massive change, as well as the cost cap being what it is, that there couldn't really be an agreement. So they just decided to settle on 3 races. And for this year in 2022, those races are Imola, the Red Bull Ring in Austria, and Interlagos in Brazil. And I do think it's interesting that last year in 2021, they had sprints at Silverstone in the UK, Monza in Italy, and also Interlagos in Brazil.
Mhm.
And I do like the fact that we're going to different places with the sprints this year than last year. I think that's a good change for this year.
Yeah, I agree, I agree, and it's exciting to see one this early in the season. It came earlier than Silverstone last year, and I'm excited about that. So what else is, changed? Because I understand there's some changes this year over last year, some rule changes for sprints.
Well, I think the biggest change is the amount of points that are distributed. Last year, there was only the first, second, and third places got 3, 2, and 1 points respectively. Whereas this year, the first 8 positions get points, and the first gets 8, the second gets 7, third gets 6th, and so on down to eighth getting 1. And I think that definitely adds a lot more importance to finishing high up in the sprint. And I have mixed feelings about this, but I'm curious what your thoughts are on that change.
Well, there's a dichotomy here that drivers want to finish well in the sprint race too, so that they have a good, grid position for the final race. But with only a point, 3 points, 2 points at stake, you might hold back a little bit, because if you wreck your car, on Saturday, then it could affect your grid placement massively on Sunday,
Yeah.
and it could affect the quality of your car even after that. But with 8 points being rewarded for second and seven, or for first and 7 for second, then there's going to be more. There's like a tension I could feel in the drivers. They have more motivation to do very well in the sprint race, but knowing that they can't crash, and otherwise they would ruin their entire weekend in essence, or at least create some challenges for them. So frankly, I kind of like it. I think it's going to make things very interesting. There's going to be more tension in the sprint race this year than last year.
Yeah, I have mixed feelings, like I said, about the amount of points. I don't I'm not excited. I don't like the fact that what is effectively qualifying gives out so much of an impact on the overall driver's championship standings.
Hmm.
But again, I don't like it, but I also don't really dislike it. I haven't really made up my mind, but maybe that's a discussion for another time.
Yeah,
So why are they doing sprint races?
that's a good question. So originally, sprint races were the brainchild of Ross Brawn. And for those that have been around Formula One for a while, you understand that Ross Brawn is a very well respected, very storied person in the history of Formula One. He, as a trained engineer, started off in the mid 70s as a machinist. He served as a mechanic on F1 teams. He worked for Williams when I think the first year they were a team. He's been an aerodynamicist. He was with Arrows. He designed their cars. He's owned his own team. And most importantly, he was the technical director of Benetton during Michael Schumacher's first two drivers' championships in 94 and 95. And in 95, Benetton, the team that they were both with, also won the constructors championship. And then Michael moved over in 97 to Ferrari. Ross Brawn followed at the end of the season for the 98 season. And then, of course,
We
um,
know what happened there.
that's where we know what happened there. Not only did Michael go on to win 5 consecutive driver
Yeah.
championships, world driver championships, but under the tutelage of Ross Brawn, Ferrari won 6 consecutive constructors
Yeah.
championships.
And then after that, Braun actually bought out what I believe was the Toyota team
It was
during
Honda.
the
It was Honda,
Honda.
actually.
Honda, okay, one of the Japanese manufacturers. But yeah, he personally, I believe, bought out the Honda team at the time during the financial crisis around the 2008 season, and then for 2009 there was the Braun team, which was only a team for 1 year and won the drivers and constructors championship, and then was bought by Mercedes, which is the Mercedes team that we have today.
Correct. Yeah, I think Jensen Button was the driver, and I
Yeah,
believe that he won the
yeah,
driver championship that year with that team. Yeah, then it was purchased by Mercedes. So you have him involved in Mercedes, Ferrari, Benetton, Michael Schumacher. And then after his stint working in F1 for the various teams, he was appointed in 2017 to a new position, a position that was newly created in 2017 called Managing Director, Motorsports and Technical Director for the Formula One Group. And that's the position he still holds. And so it's within his capacity, within that position, that last year he decided to come up with the sprint race format to experiment with it and to use it in 3 venues. And I think, I was a little dubious when I heard about these sprint races and things changing in Formula One. But when I understood that it was him that came up with the idea, I was much more open to it just because of his storied history in Formula One. So I have some implicit trust in him, knowing his history in the sport.
yeah. And F1 was actually looking to make changes to the weekend format for a while, and not that we need to get into all of their various ideas, but things that were floated around were things like reverse grid sprint races and all kinds of other things that felt a little bit more manufactured. And this was eventually what was settled on. And so they tried it 3 weekends last year, and overall it was received pretty positively. So they kept it for this year.
Yeah, exactly. The only other change that we need to address, and this is somewhat confusing, but it was to correct a confusion. Last year they called it sprint qualifying, which it was confusing because you had qualifying on Friday, sprint qualifying on Saturday, and then the race on Sunday. And sprint qualifying could be confused with the qualifying for the sprint race, which it wasn't. It was a
Yeah.
it was a sprint qualifying race that was determining the grid positions for Sunday.
Yeah, you effectively had what was called qualifying, that was for the sprint race, and then sprint qualifying.
Right.
So you have qualifying for the sprint, and then sprint qualifying, and then the race, and
Yeah.
that's just way too confusing.
Yeah, exactly. So this year it is qualifying. It is the sprint is what they're calling Saturday, and then the race on Sunday, the
The
actual
Grand Prix,
race,
yeah,
the Grand Prix,
yeah.
the Grand Prix on Sunday.
So the only other interesting note that I have is that there is one fewer practice session. So where there's normally 3 on a normal weekend, there's only 2. And I think that's interesting because there's only one of those prior to qualifying and then another one prior to the sprint, which basically means that each team has far less time to get accustomed to the track, how their car handles and setup, and that can definitely shake things up a bit more.
Well, what makes that interesting is since the cars are completely redesigned this year, there are changes being made in the factories back home in Milton Keynes or wherever. And then, changes are being shipped out to each venue. And Ferrari is claiming that this weekend they have some significant changes going in. Red Bull has hinted of the same. Mercedes, on the other hand, has said they're not changing anything. And I think if you're losing a practice session, that may have something to do with why Mercedes is not going to make a significant change this weekend. Probably it could
Yeah.
be because it is a sprint weekend and they're losing a practice session.
Yeah, they'll end up getting less data because of it. So,
Right. So you don't want to make a bunch of changes when you're going to have less diagnostic data before the race
right.
itself. Anyway, last year when we had the first sprint race of 2021 at Silverstone, you and I were discussing it beforehand, and I got the feeling that you were not exactly happy about it. But
I'm still not.
but my impression was, if you remember, after Silverstone last year, you're well. Why don't you address your initial concerns? What were your concerns with the whole sprint thing?
Yeah, so initially it felt like, well, there was a concern that a lot of people had that it would end up being fairly processional because you only get points if you're in the top 3 and you only get 3 at best, and it directly affects your, like, if you crash during the sprint, you're starting the actual Grand Prix at the back. And so it's like there was a fear that it would be far too processional, and thankfully all 3 rounds of the sprints last year proved that to pretty much not be the case.
Exactly. And in fact, if you remember, it was the opposite.
Yeah.
I remember talking to you after that first sprint race, and you were excited, and I wasn't as surprised as you were, and that's because just knowing the nature of a race car driver. I mean, these guys literally, if they're in the grocery store together and they find themselves heading to the register, pushing a cart, they're going to race each other to the register. It's what they do.
Yeah, true.
You can't put these guys on a racetrack and have them go around in a procession. I mean, look at how hard it is for Max to stay behind a safety car. you know, they just want to
Yeah,
race. So I kind of
yeah,
I thought, well, it doesn't matter how dangerous it is. These guys are going to go for it, and I think they
yeah.
did. I didn't see any real hesitation last year in these sprint races. They were pretty exciting.
Yeah, yeah, I think my text to you after the sprint in Silverstone was, "Okay, I was wrong, that was good." Something like
Okay,
that.
but yet you still have concerns about it, as you mentioned briefly. So what are what are those concerns?
The only other issue, that I have, I think is more important, and it's for a long time, for basically always, in F1, you have qualifying, and the hot lap that you set directly impacts the starting grid on the race for the race. And there was always this dynamic between qualifying and the Grand Prix, and maybe it's too pretentious a term, but it feels like these manufactured excitement races, these sprints, it feels like they diminish the purity of the qualifying event and what qualifying actually means. And I still have mixed feelings about that. I haven't landed on one side or the other, and I'm just glad that they're not in every event. They're just only a handful.
Well, it's kind of funny. Somebody might predict that I would be the guy with that opinion, and you would be the guy that's championing the sprint races. Because in this case, we are on opposite ends of the spectrum.
Yeah, you're the boomer who's been around for ages and seen all the changes, and you're like, nah. Like, you'd think you'd be the curmudgeonly that's like, nah, no changes. This is to get your
I
newfangled sprints
don't
out of here.
I don't like change.
Yeah.
Um, no, but actually,
Yeah.
I like the sprint. I like racing, so I like the sprint race. I like the tension. I like the fact that these guys have to put it on the line. I like that dichotomy of I have to finish top. I can't crash, or it
Yeah.
screws me up for Sunday
Yeah.
because Sunday's where the big points are.
Yep.
These guys get 8 points for first place here, but it's 25 points for first place on Sunday.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of risk and reward here. To me, it adds a layer of competition and competitiveness and a layer of interest
Yeah.
and then, but I think we have another segment here because qualifying has changed itself over the years quite a bit.
Yeah.
So the Q1, Q2, Q3 method of qualifying has not always been around. It was done way differently.
Yeah,
Um,
I think honestly there's an entire podcast episode in that. So,
I agree. So stay tuned for that. We will do
yeah.
a deep dive on the history of qualifying in Formula One.
But for now, the sprints last year proved to be quite exciting. They were a big hit, particularly Brazil. If you remember, Lewis starting all the way in the back and fighting all the way through the field, that was quite something to behold. And so hopefully they will continue to be exciting throughout the future, and that I personally don't want them to happen at every weekend, but I think having a couple throughout the season is actually interesting and spices things up. And that's kind of what the goal was to begin with. So I think that's it. Anything else on sprints before we wrap up?
Just one more thing. This weekend, since there's a different format, it's a sprint race format. We're going to be releasing one video covering the qualifying on Friday and the sprint race on Saturday. That'll be covered in one video, and then we'll release second video on Monday covering the race on Sunday.
Yeah, so that first video should be coming out Saturday evening. And then the second one that will be a little bit longer, covering the race as well as some other, general discussion as we like to do. That'll be on Monday. So we'll see you then. Thanks so much for watching and take care of yourselves.